is not to blame for this, sir. He acted in good faith.
In good faith.
Nettlecombe was by no means a grand estate, and it had long since stopped pretending to be one. It sat low in a fold of the Somerset Hills, a square grey manor house with leggy ivy clinging to its west face. The walled garden had been left to run to herbs and cabbages, simply because cabbages were far more useful than roses to a family that had to count its candles. In late autumn, the valley filled every morning with a thick white mist that lingered until nearly noon, while the rooks quarreled in the bare elms behind the stable. The entire estate had the settled, slightly threadbare dignity of a family that had once been of great consequence and had come down in the world without quite noticing when. It was into this very house on a raw evening near the end of that autumn that trouble came to dinner. Eulalia Lindale was 25 in age. The county had already decided was far too old. She had made her peace with that verdict years before they even thought to deliver it. She was the only daughter of Mr. Lindale, a gentle, anxious, kindly man who had inherited far more emotional debts than financial ones and had managed to discharge both quite poorly. Her mother was long dead. Eulalia had run the household since she was 17. This meant she knew the true state of the ledger, the exact price of coal, and the precise number of days a joint of mutton could be made to last. She was not plain, though the local assemblies had agreed she was. That was because she wore altered gowns 3 seasons out of date, refused to simper, and had a habit of looking at people as though she could see exactly what they were, rather than what they wished to seem. This last quality had cost her far more suitors than her dresses ever did. Men do not always care to be seen so clearly. She had gray eyes, a level gaze, and a tongue she had learned to keep strictly behind her teeth in most company, because a poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no struggling household can afford. Most company, though, not all. Her father had been a nervous wreck for 3 days over this dinner. A gentleman of real consequence was arriving, a Mr. Pendrith connected somehow to the grand family whose estates lay 2 counties north. Mr. Lindale had got it into his head that this guest might be persuaded to back a small investment, one that would surely restore their fortunes at a single stroke. Eulalia had heard too many such certainties over the years, learning to meet them with a quiet calm her father always mistook for encouragement. She never told him her real thoughts. Instead, she simply saw to it that a bright fire burned in the dining parlor, that the last of their decent wine was decanted, and that the mutton was disguised as thoroughly as mutton ever could be. Even so, she was late coming down. A crisis in the kitchen had delayed her, the sort of small domestic catastrophe that always strikes at the worst possible moment. By the time she had smoothed her hair and stepped into the parlor, the introductions were over, and everyone was seated. Her father half rose flustered, saying only "my daughter," as he gestured toward her seat. The guest across the table inclined his head perhaps a fraction of an inch, returning instantly to whatever he had been not quite saying. So Eulalia sat down beside a man whose name she had missed, and whose rank she did not know. She took him naturally enough for just another of her father's hopeful acquaintances, a well-to-do gentleman passing through, leaving promises in his wake. Yet, he was far younger than she had expected. Perhaps 34, with dark hair, a hard, handsome, aristocratic face, and eyes of a strange, clear amber that missed nothing and gave nothing back. He was dressed with a plainness she did not yet understand, was the mark of a man so secure in his own importance that he had no need to advertise it. From the first course to the third, he was quietly, unmistakably contemptuous of everything around him. He was not loud about it. That was the first thing she noticed. His cruelty, if a coldness so effortless, deserved the name, left no visible marks. He answered her father's eager questions in the briefest possible words, offering a faint, weary courtesy that was far worse than outright rudeness. It made every single one of Mr. Lindale's hopeful sentences sound utterly foolish the moment it was uttered. He let a silence follow each of her father's jokes. A silence exactly 1 beat too long. He surveyed the room, the wine, the disguised mutton, and the careful fire, with the incurious eye of a man cataloguing how little was worth his time. Her father, who was neither stupid nor blind, seemed to shrink before her eyes, laughing too quickly, refilling the guest's glass, too often reaching desperately for an approval that was never going to come. Eulalia watched this unfold for the better part of an hour, and something deep inside her, some long-buried fire, began quietly to burn. She knew exactly what this guest was doing. She had seen it done before by people who confused their good fortune with actual merit. He had taken her father's measure in the first 5 minutes, deemed him of no possible use, and decided the rest of the evening was merely a tax to be paid as cheaply as possible. He did not know, and clearly did not care, that the wine he was letting grow warm had been hoarded for a year, or that the man he was diminishing had spent 3 days in anxious hope. In a house like Nettlecombe, hope was never a cheap commodity. He believed himself to be among lesser people, and he was determined to make them feel it. He was doing this in her father's own house, at her father's own table, having eaten her father's bread. It was the bread that broke her patience. Some old lesson of her mother's, some scrap of the catechism rose within her at the sight of a guest, taking a family's very best and repaying it with nothing but disdain. The guest set down his glass, remarking to no one in particular, in a tone of mild fatigue, that he wondered the countryside did not bore its inhabitants into an early grave, since he could not conceive how any rational creature filled the hours between one dull dinner and the next. Perhaps Eulalia said before she had even decided to speak, by learning not to be dull company at the dinner itself. The table went dead sot. Her father made a small choked sound. The guest turned his head, looking at her fully for the very first time, and his amber eyes, previously half-lidded with boredom, opened a fraction. She should have stopped. She knew, even as the hot blood rushed to her face, that she ought to stop. But she did not. "You have sat at my father's table for 2 hours," she said, her voice remarkably steady and low, because a lady does not shout, even when she has decided to ruin herself. "You have eaten his food and drunk his wine, giving him nothing in return but the burden of watching you be bored by him. He asks you a simple question, and you make him regret ever asking. You find us all very tedious, sir, and perhaps we are. But there is a profound tedium in a guest who has been shown every kindness a modest house can offer, yet cannot be troubled to show ordinary civility in return. Boredom is not some misfortune that happens to you. It is a discourtesy you are actively doing to us. I only thought you might like to know the difference, since no one, I suspect, has ever dared to tell you." The silence that followed had a heavy weight to it. Somewhere in the kitchen, a metal pan was set down. Her father had turned the exact color of the white tablecloth. The guest did not answer. He looked at her for a very long moment, and something shifted behind that amber gaze, something she could not read. She braced herself for the freezing set-down she knew must come. The pleasant, devastating reply of a man who knew 100 different ways to make a woman regret her tongue. But it did not come. Instead, the corner of his hard mouth twitched very slightly. Not a smile, but the barest beginning of one. "No," he said simply. "No one ever has." And that was all. He turned the conversation with a deftness that startled her, steering it to a subject her father could actually speak to: the drainage of the low meadow. For the rest of the dinner, he was, if not warm, at least entirely present. He drew Mr. Lindale out on the one subject where the poor man possessed real practical knowledge, allowing him to enjoy for 20 minutes the simple dignity of being listened to. Eulalia sat through it with a pounding heart, her mind absolutely certain that she had done something entirely irreparable. She did not look at him again. She was deeply relieved when the tablecloth was finally cleared, allowing her to escape to the drawing room and nurse her shame in private. She learned who he actually was an hour later, long after his carriage had gone. Her father came to find her. He was not angry, which was somehow far worse. He sat down heavily, looking at her with an expression of such complicated emotion that she rose in sudden alarm. "Papa, what is it?" "I know I spoke out of turn," she said. "I am sorry. I will write to him. I will do anything you—" "Eulalia," her father interrupted quietly. "Do you know who that was, Mr. Pendrith? Your friend from the north?" That said, her father was the Duke of Pendrith. Philip VI, Duke of Pendrith. Pendrith is both the family name and the title. He is one of the greatest men in England, and I have spent a year trying to secure just 5 minutes of his attention. Tonight he sat at my table and my own daughter told him he had no manners. Eulalia sat down again rather suddenly. "A duke," she whispered. "A duke." She thought of his plain coat, which had not been cheap at all. She thought of his absolute certainty, the way the room seemed to arrange itself around him without his lifting a finger, and the desperate way her father had reached for his favor. She remembered her dreadful words one by one, spoken to one of England's greatest men at her father's table the very night all their hopes hung in the balance. She buried her face in her hands, whispering that she had ruined them. Yet her father strangely did not seem to agree. He simply sat in silence, slowly turning his empty pipe. "He asked for your name at the door," her father said softly. "He made me repeat it, then said something I did not quite understand. He told me that you were the only person to speak the truth to him in 11 years, and that I must value you." Her father looked up, his eyes bewildered. "I truly do not know what to make of it, child. I do not know at all." Meanwhile, the Duke rode north through the darkness for a long way before he allowed himself to think of her. When he did, it was with a sharp irritation, because the memory simply would not leave him alone. Philip Pendrith had been spoken to by many people in his life. He had been flattered by men seeking patronage, courted by women wanting his name praised by tenants, and deferred to by his equals. Nearly everyone he met had lied to him gently and continuously, since the day at 32, when the title crashed down on him like a roof. He had learned to hear the silent want beneath every word, and that want was always there. Eventually, a man stops listening to anything else. He had only gone to Nettlecombe as a favor to his mother's relation, mostly to escape his own relentless household. He had expected a dull evening among hopeful strangers, and he had received precisely that. But then, a woman in a repaired gown had looked across a table of disguised mutton and told him without anger or fear that he was being unforgivably rude. She wanted nothing from him. That was the detail his mind kept returning to on the dark road. She had no idea who he was believing him. A mere gentleman. He was a man she would likely never see again, someone who could do nothing for her and nothing to her. Yet she had spoken the truth anyway. Because it was true and because he had insulted her father under his own roof, she simply could not endure it. He had watched the color rush to her face, realizing she was terrified and fully aware she was doing herself harm, and yet she did it regardless. He could not remember the last time anyone had risked a single thing to tell him the truth. He was not sure anyone ever had. Then, there was the other matter, which he hated to admit she had been right. He had been rude. He had entered that modest house, carrying a heavy gray grief, letting it freeze him until he spent a decent man's hope like loose change. Because it was easier than feeling anything at all. His brother would have been ashamed of him. The thought hit him before he could stop it, bringing its familiar sharp ache. He rode the rest of the way home in the heavy darkness that had been his only companion since the previous winter, since Edmund died. Edmund, his younger brother, who was only 24. All warmth where Philip was nothing but cold reserve. He was the one person alive who loved him without wanting a single thing in return. Edmund had caught a fever on a walking tour in Italy, a stupid, ordinary sickness, the kind that steals the young for no reason. By the time the letter reached England, he had been 3 weeks in the ground under a foreign sky, and Philip had not been there. He had never written that last letter. He had let a foolish coldness stand between them over some forgotten argument he could no longer even remember. He had simply frozen after that. He knew it. He had welcomed the ice because feeling nothing was easier than feeling the grief. 11 years he had told the man at the door, meaning his entire time as Duke. But the truth was far narrower and far worse. It had only been 1 year. It was Edmund. The woman at the table had reached straight through a year of ice and found the man underneath without even trying. Philip Pendrith rode home through the dark, entirely unaware that a door he believed permanently shut had been left slightly ajar. He told himself he would forget her. He was a duke, and she was a country nobody with a sharp tongue. That was the end of it. Except he did not forget. Winter settled over the counties, and Eulalia went back to managing the accounts, the coal and the mutton, doing her absolute best to forget that mortifying evening. It should have been easy. The Duke of Pendrith was gone back to the cold, grand life that bred such men. She would never see him again. The only real loss was her father's foolish investment scheme, which she had never believed in anyway. She had spoken her mind and paid the price. That was that. Except as winter deepened, her father began to talk of London again. It was an old dream of his, renewed every year with the stubborn hope of a man who never learned. And every year Eulalia had gently turned him down. There was an aunt in the city, her mother's sister, Mrs. Verity Cardew, a widow with a small fortune but massive ambition. For years she had tried to bring Eulalia to town, believing a girl not yet completely on the shelf might still find a husband if placed in the right rooms. Eulalia hated the idea. She knew exactly what a London season meant for a woman of her age and modest means. It meant standing on the fringes of ballrooms in a cheap gown, being inspected, and passed over, pitied by the kind, ignored by the cruel, and returning home in the spring, having spent money they did not have just to buy another year of humiliation. She had refused for 4 years straight. Yet this winter, for reasons she did not care to examine, she let herself be persuaded. Perhaps her father's disappointment over the Duke of Pendrith had aged him too much. Or perhaps at 25, she could feel the door of her own life starting to slip shut and wanted to look through it just once before it closed forever. Whatever the reason, when her aunt's letter arrived in the dead of winter, pressing the old plan, Eulalia surprised everyone, herself most of all, by agreeing to go. She had no idea the Duke of Pendrith would be in London. She would never have gone if she had. And she certainly knew nothing of Lady Sidonia Mall. Years ago, that lady had decided she would be the next Duchess of Pendrith, waiting with the cold patience of the truly determined for the Duke to emerge from his grief. This was the season she intended to finally close her hand. London in the damp end of winter was just as bleak as Eulalia had feared, and her aunt's house off a fashionable square was just as suffocating. Mrs. Cardew was not cruel, but she was relentless. On their first evening, she inspected her niece the way a general surveys a difficult battlefield, immediately organizing dressmakers' invitations and a list of eligible bachelors ranked by wealth and physical ailments. Eulalia endured the fittings and the parade because she had agreed to it. But through it all, she kept her silent counsel and her own dry, watchful gaze. She watched the glittering gears of the marriage market turn with the detachment of a woman who knew it would never offer her anything and was not sure she wanted it to. Then 3 weeks into the season, she saw him at the Harkness ball. She did not see him enter. She simply felt the room change like a shadow passing over a sunny field. A sudden wave of turned heads, hushed voices, and fluttering fans. She looked where everyone was staring, and there he was. The Duke of Pendrith, dressed in deep black, looking taller and colder than she remembered. His amber eyes swept over the crowd with the same weary indifference she had seen at her father's table. For a second, a wave of hot, total embarrassment washed over her. She turned to hide behind a pillar like a frightened schoolgirl, but she was too slow. His gaze swept the room and stopped. He froze. All the boredom vanished from his face, replaced instantly by something sharper and far more unsettling. Her heart sank as she realized he knew exactly who she was. Whatever was about to happen next, she was powerless to stop it. Instead, the Duke of Pendrith walked across the entire length of the ballroom in full view of London high society. He stopped right in front of a nobody in a remade gown and bowed to her as if she were royalty. "Miss Lindale," he said. The room abandoned all pretense of looking away. "Your Grace," Eulalia managed, curtsying deeply. She could think of nothing else to say, every polite phrase vanishing from her mind. The only thing in her mind was a desperate wish to sink through the floor. She had already learned where speaking the truth to this man led. He noted that she was surprised to see him. She replied she was astonished he would be seen speaking to her after she had told him he had no manners. The near smile returned that unfinished shadow at the corner of his mouth. As it happens, Miss Lindale, that is precisely why I wish to be seen speaking to you. May I have this dance? I find I would rather talk to you than to anyone else in this room. And I have discovered in the months since your father's dinner that this is a sensation so novel I am disinclined to waste it. She danced with him. She could hardly refuse, not with half of London watching. And in any case, she found she did not actually want to refuse, which alarmed her far more than the watching did. He danced well, saying very little. What he did say was dry, honest, and entirely free of the flattery she had braced herself to hear. By the end of it, she had forgotten to be mortified, and had begun against every instinct of self-preservation to enjoy herself. She did not see Lady Sidonia Maule at the edge of the ballroom watching the Duke of Pendrith dance with an unknown girl in an old gown quietly doing her sums. He called on her aunt's house 2 days later. He called again the week after. He took no trouble to disguise his visits, and London, which feeds on such things, went to work at once. By the middle of the season, the strangest rumor in years was whispering through the drawing rooms. The cold Duke of Pendrith, who had turned away the loveliest, wealthiest women in England for a decade, was paying court to a penniless country spinster of 25. And the girl, if the gossip could be believed, had once told him to his face that he was ill-bred. Some found it charming. Most found it incomprehensible. One found it utterly intolerable. Eulalia herself understood none of it. She only knew that the man who came to her aunt's shabby drawing-room was not the man from the dinner. Or rather, he was that same man, but with the ice gone out of him. He talked to her as though her opinions actually mattered, asking questions no one had ever asked her, and truly listened to the answers. She remembered one afternoon in particular. Her aunt, sensing a triumph beyond her wildest arithmetic, had contrived to be called from the room on a transparent pretext, leaving them alone with the door correctly ajar. Eulalia had braced herself for whatever a duke did with an unchaperoned girl. He did nothing of the kind. Instead, he picked up the book lying open on the table beside her, a volume of sermons she had been reading not from piety but because it was the only book in the house she had not already read twice. He asked her with what seemed like genuine curiosity what she thought of it, and she told him. She said it was pompous and self-satisfied, that its author had plainly never in his life been poor or frightened or hungry, and that a man who had never wanted for anything had no business instructing those who wanted for everything on the virtue of contentment. She said it all before she remembered to whom she was speaking, and then she stopped, appalled. He was a man who had never wanted for anything either, and she had as good as called him a fool to his face for the second time. He was not offended. He set the book down and looked at her, those amber eyes growing thoughtful. He said, "You are right. I have read that book a dozen times and admired it, and you have shown me in a single sentence why it is worthless. I shall never be able to admire it again. You have a genius, Miss Lindale, for spoiling a man's comfortable opinions." After a moment, his voice grew quieter. "It is the most valuable quality I have ever encountered, and I have met with a great deal that the world calls valuable. Do you know that you are the only person who argues with me? Everyone else has agreed with me for 11 years. It is like living in a house full of mirrors. One begins to think one has vanished." She did not know what to say to that, so she simply told the truth, that she thought it must be a very lonely way to live. He looked at her for a long moment and did not answer. She understood she had touched a raw nerve and she let it be. She knew she looked forward to his visits in a way that terrified her. She was no fool. She knew what could and could not be, and a duke did not marry a Lindale of Nettlecombe. She told herself this daily. She insisted he was merely amusing himself, that great men have their whims, and she would be wise to guard her heart against a thing that could only end in heartbreak. She was still telling herself this when he asked her to marry him, knocking every prepared defense out of her head at a single stroke. He did not ask the way she had feared, or even half hoped. he asked in a way she had never imagined. They were walking in her aunt's narrow garden. He stopped by the bare wall and spoke without preamble, in the plain voice he reserved for true things. "Miss Lindale, I am going to say something to you, and I am going to say it badly. I ask you to hear me to the end before you answer." "I generally hear people to the end," she replied. "It is one of my few virtues." "It is your chief one," he said. He was not smiling now.
"I am going to make you an offer. It is not the offer a woman hopes for, and I will not insult you by dressing it up as one.
Hear the truth of it, because you above all people are owed the truth. I am hunted, Miss Lindale. I have been hunted since I was 23. Every unmarried woman in England with an ambitious mother has been aimed at me like a gun for 11 years, and one in particular has decided the matter is settled, waiting only for me to agree. And I am tired to the bone of it. My own mother presses me monthly. I cannot attend a dinner without being inventoried as a prospect. I want it to stop, and there is only one thing on earth that stops it, which is a wife." Eulalia stood very still. "And you," he went on, "are hunted too in your own way. Do not tell me you are not. I have watched your aunt drive you through this season like a beast to market. I have watched you stand at the edge of rooms, looked over, and passed by. And I have watched you bear it with more dignity than the people doing the looking will manage in their entire lives. You do not want this any more than I do. You would rather be at home, running your father's house, speaking your mind, and being left alone. Neither of us wants what the world is trying to force on us. So I am proposing that we refuse it together." "You are proposing," Eulalia said slowly, "a marriage of convenience. I am proposing exactly that, and I will not pretend it is more. Marry me and the hunt ends for both of us. Your father need never worry for you again. Your aunt is silenced. My mother is silenced. Lady Sidonia and the whole marching army of them are silenced. You would have a great house to run, which you would run better than any woman I know, and your own rooms, your own income, and your own freedom. No man will ever look through you again, because a duchess is looked at Miss Lindale, whatever else she is. I offer you respect, honesty, and my word that I will never lie to you. I ask in return only that you stand beside me, so we may both be left in peace. I am not offering you love."
"I do not think I have any left to offer. I froze some time ago, and I have not thawed, whatever you may think you did, at your father's table. But I would rather be frozen beside a woman who tells me the truth than warm beside a woman who tells me only what I wish to hear. That is the whole of it. That is my offer. Now you may speak." It was, Eulalia thought afterward, the strangest proposal any woman could have received, and the most honest. And she answered him honestly, because he had asked her to. "You are right that I do not want the market," she said. "You are right that I would rather be left alone, but you are wrong about one thing. Your Grace and I will tell you what it is, since you value my telling you things. You say you have no love left to offer. I do not believe you. A man with no love left does not ask a woman to marry him simply because he cannot bear to see her looked through. He does not remember a stranger's name for months. He does not cross a ballroom in front of all London to bow to a nobody who insulted him. Those are not the acts of a frozen man. They are the acts of a man who has frozen himself on purpose because something hurt him past bearing, and who does not yet know the ice is already cracking. I do not know what hurt you. You need not tell me. But do not tell me you cannot love, because I do not believe it is true. And I will not begin a marriage, even a convenient one, on something that is not true." He looked at her for a long time in the gray garden light. When he spoke, his voice had changed. "My brother died last winter," he said. "Edmund. I was not there. I let a coldness stand between us over nothing, and then he was gone. I never mended it. I have not been able to feel anything since without feeling that. I have told no one that. I do not know why I have told you." "Because I did not ask," Eulalia said gently. "People tell me things because I do not ask them. It is my other virtue." And something changed in his hard face, then some small terrible loosening. For just a moment the Duke of Pendrith was not a duke at all, but only a man who had lost his brother, and had been carrying that weight alone.
Eulalia saw it. She did not look away, and she did not fill the silence with comfort he had not asked for. She simply stood with him in it. That was all. It was the one thing no one else had ever done for him. He had no word for it, but he felt it, and it decided him about her far more surely than any answer to his proposal ever could. "Then, let me say it plainly," he said, recovering. "Will you marry me, Miss Lindale, on the terms I have named, and on one more that I add now, which is that neither of us shall lie to the other, for as long as we both live, however much it costs?" She should have said no. It was madness. It was a bargain struck between two people who had agreed not to love each other, the least promising foundation a marriage could ever have. But she thought of Nettlecombe and her father's tired, hopeful face. She thought of the years spent standing at the edges of rooms. And she thought, most of all, of a man who wanted her, precisely because she told the truth. The one thing about herself. The world had always counted a fault. No one had ever wanted that. She believed no one ever would. Yes, she said on those terms. Yes. Their marriage was the sensation of the season, celebrated at High Hall in the early summer. Eulalia went from a made-over gown in a narrow drawing room to the mistress of one of the greatest houses in England in a single spring. She managed the transformation with a composure that surprised everyone who had wagered against her. It came from a simple truth: she never confused the house with herself. High Hall did not overawe her. It was only a very large version of a problem she had been solving since she was 17. How to run a household well on whatever resources it possessed. And High Hall had resources without end. She found the work suited her. Yet the great house had received her on that first day with the same veiled contempt its master had once shown her father. The upper servants lined the hall to meet the new duchess. She had felt their judgment come down on her like a sudden change in the weather, a country nobody in her borrowed grandeur. She knew they were waiting to find her, wanting exactly as the county assemblies had once waited. She walked the line of them slowly, and then instead of the little gracious speech they expected, she stopped before a young under-housemaid. The girl was swaying on her feet, gray-faced, plainly ill, and utterly terrified of being seen in such a state on a day like this. Eulalia said quietly that she was to go and lie down at once, that some broth must be sent up, and that her wages were not to be docked. The housekeeper began to protest. Eulalia looked at her with that level gray gaze, saying a house is known by how it treats those who can do nothing for it, and she would have this house act kindly or know the reason why. The girl was sent to bed, and the hall fell silent. Something in the ranks of servants shifted. They had expected either a tyrant or a fool, but found instead a woman who noticed it before anything else in her vast new domain, a sick child at the end of the row. By nightfall the story had spread through the whole of High Hall. The house did not yield to her all at once, but it began that day to be hers. She found, too, that she was not unhappy, which she had never expected. Philip was as good as his word. He gave her respect, honesty, in her own domain, asking nothing of her that had not been agreed. If the marriage was a bargain, it was at least honestly kept on both sides. They took their meals together, at first seated at the enormous formal table that had served Pendrith dukes for 200 years, the two of them marooned at opposite ends of an acre of mahogany. Then, one evening, Eulalia had the footman lay both places at the same end, close enough to speak across. She looked at her husband with a steadiness that dared him to object. He did not. He looked at the shortened distance between their chairs with an expression she could not quite read, and then he sat down beside her. After that, they always dined this way, and neither of them ever spoke of it. It was one of the small unspoken treaties by which the bond between them slowly grew. For it did grow. Neither had planned it, and neither named it, but it grew all the same. It grew in the long, ordinary evenings, in the shared work of the estate, in the way she told him the truth about his tenants, his accounts, and himself, and the way he came by degrees to rely on her. He had never meant to consult her. It had begun almost by accident during a wet week, when he was wrestling with building a mill on the river. Over their shortened dinner table she asked what would become of the 4 families whose water meadow the mill would flood. He had not thought of those families. His agent had not thought of them either, or had simply not troubled to mention them. Eulalia laid the whole matter out in 3 plain sentences: the gain, the cost, and the 4 families who would pay that cost while he took the profit. He sat back, looked at her, and felt something he had not felt in years, the sensation of being shown a thing he had been too high up to see. He did not build that mill. Instead, he built a smaller one further down where it flooded no one. After that, he brought her the difficult questions as a matter of course. It was not because the Duchess was owed a voice, but because hers was the one voice in his whole establishment that told him what he did not wish to hear. He had discovered that he could no longer do without it. He thought about that while riding the boundaries of his land, one gray morning near the turn of summer. He had married her to be left in peace, he reminded himself. That had been their bargain. Yet here he was, arranging the hours of his day around, the chance of her company saving up the day's absurdities to tell her because no one else would find them amusing in quite the same way. And the great gray weight he had carried since winter was for whole hours at a time simply gone. He did not know when it had vanished. He only knew he woke now without his first thought being Edmund, and that he had begun once or twice to laugh. The house he had returned to as a dead man was full these days of a living woman's voice telling him plainly when he was wrong, and he would sooner cut off his hand than go back to the silence. He had told her he had no love left to give, and he had believed it. He rode home that morning, no longer sure that was true. Not being sure frightened him more than grief ever had, because grief he understood, and this he did not. Not all of it was heavy. She would have been sorry later to suggest those first months at High Hall were only the careful tending of a wounded man. They were not. There were ordinary evenings, and some of them were happy. In the library, the room the length of a barn, they fell into the habit of sitting together on winter nights. She had her accounts or a book. He had whatever a duke does of an evening. The 2 of them sat at opposite ends of a great sofa with a fire crackling between them and the wind at the tall windows. She made him laugh for the first time on such a night. She had been reading aloud half under her breath from a novel her aunt had pressed upon her, a fashionable romance of the most breathless kind, in which a pale heroine swooned through 3 volumes into the arms of a brooding lord. Eulalia had begun to supply the story with a commentary of her own, dry asides on the improbability of a woman fainting so often without injury, or on the brooding lord's evident need of a good dinner and an early night. She had forgotten Philip was listening, until she heard him make a sound she had never heard from him before. She looked up. He was laughing. Not a mere smile, that unfinished thing at the corner of his mouth, but a real laugh, helpless and surprised, as though it had escaped before he could stop it. He looked almost alarmed by it himself. "Do that again," he said when he had recovered. "Read me the next part. I have not laughed in longer than I can tell you, and I find I have missed it, though. I did not know I had." So she read him the next part and improved it as she went. And he laughed again. Something in the long, cold library, warmed by more than just the fire. She did not think of it as a victory. She did not think of it at all then, but she remembered afterward that it was the night she stopped guarding her heart against him. A woman cannot go on protecting herself from a man she has heard laugh like that at her own foolish jokes on a winter night in a house they were both learning to call home. She saw the grief itself only once in those early months, and she never forgot it. She had gone looking for him on a still evening and found him in a part of the house. She had not entered a small room kept shut. She opened the door before she understood what it was. It was a boy's room. Edmund's room, kept exactly as he had left it. The books, the fishing rods, a coat on a hook, a child's whole abandoned life, held in a stopped moment. And Philip was standing in the middle of it, in the last of the light. Not weeping, only standing the way a man stands at a grave. Perhaps she should have withdrawn. She did not. She came in quietly, stood beside him, and looked at the coat on the hook, saying nothing at all. There was nothing to say that would not have been a lie or an insult. The only true thing she had to offer was to be there, so he would not be alone in it. They stood for a long time. At last he said in a low voice that he kept meaning to have it cleared, but had not been able to. And she replied that he must not clear it. Then there was no law saying he must. "Keep it as long as you need it," she said, "and clear it when you are ready. If you are never ready, then never clear it, and let no one tell you that grief keeps a calendar." He turned and looked at her as if she had said something extraordinary, and perhaps she had. After a moment he took her hand there in his dead brother's room. It was the first time he had ever reached for her of his own accord. She let him hold it. That was all, yet it was everything. His mother saw it before either of them did. The Dowager Duchess of Pendrith was a small, sharp, formidable woman named Lavinia. She was fully prepared to disapprove of her son's mad marriage with all the force at her command, arriving at High Hall, armed to despise the country, nobody her son had inexplicably chosen. She lasted by her own account about a day and a half. Eulalia neither cringed before her nor flattered her, which no one else in 30 years had failed to do. She simply met her plainly and treated her kindly. On the second morning, Eulalia told her that her assigned blue rooms faced north and were cold. She insisted she take the south rooms instead, which were warmer and had a better view. She moved the dowager without fuss into real comfort. It was such a small thing. Yet the old woman who had spent 30 years being deferred to, but never once cared for, found herself unexpectedly moved. By the end of the week, she had gone over entirely, becoming the fiercest supporter the new Duchess had. "He is not frozen with you," the dowager told Eulalia one afternoon, watching her son ride in from the farm. "You may not see it from the inside, but I do. He came back to me last winter, after Edmund. A dead man, my dear. I had given him up. And now, there is a living man riding up my drive. And I know very well who is responsible, whatever you two tell yourselves about your convenient arrangement." She fixed Eulalia with her sharp old eyes. "Do not mistake me for a sentimental woman," she said. "I am not. But I have buried one son this year, and I will not watch the other freeze to death, because he was never told plainly that he is loved. You must tell him. You must tell him when the time comes, because you are the only person he will believe." Eulalia did not answer. She was not ready to. But she carried those words with her like a stone in her pocket, taking them out to look at them more often than she meant to. The trouble, when it came from London, and it wore a beautiful face. Lady Sidonia Mall did not accept defeat. She had spent years preparing to be the Duchess of Pendrith. She had built her entire sense of worth on the certainty of that title, and she was not a woman who could simply let go of something she had carried for so long. When she learned the Duke had married a nobody, a country spinster with a sharp tongue and no fortune, she felt it not as a disappointment but as a theft. With the same cold patience she had once used to win him, she set out to unmake the marriage that had cheated her. She began with words because words were her weapon. She could not attack the Duke directly, so she targeted the Duchess. She did it in the pleasant, smiling, bloodless way of her class, ensuring no single remark could ever be held against her. She whispered in the right drawing rooms that the marriage was a great joke, that the Duke had married the girl on a whim and already regretted it. She claimed a countrywoman who had insulted him at dinner had trapped him by the sheer novelty of her rudeness. She wondered aloud with sweet malice how long a great man could be amused by such coarse country manners before they began to grate. She took Eulalia's honesty, her sole distinction, and turned it into a joke, framing it as rustic crudeness, a total lack of the polish a duchess required. And because Sidonia was clever, and high society always welcomes a victim, the poison spread quickly. The gossip reached High Hall the way these things always do, last of all to the person they concern. Eulalia began to notice a coolness in the local families. There was a veiled amusement in the way people watched her at dinner, as if waiting to be entertained by some vulgar slip. She understood it fully when two local ladies called on her. They sat in her drawing room, drank her tea, and with exquisite politeness did precisely the work Lady Sidonia had sent them to do. They admired everything just a shade too much. With wide, sympathetic eyes, they asked if managing such a massive estate was not a terrible burden. Coming as she did from a humbler background, they wondered aloud if she might prefer to leave such matters to a housekeeper who actually understood them. They mentioned how droll the story of her first dinner had become in London, laughing kindly as they invited her to join in the joke at her own expense, the country girl who had scolded a duke over the mutton. Pouring the tea, Eulalia saw the trap. She could laugh along and become their pet, the amusing rustic who knew her place. Or she could take offense and prove herself a vulgar creature who could not take a joke. Both paths led exactly where they wanted her to go, so she took neither. She set down the teapot and said pleasantly that the story was entirely true. She had indeed told the gentleman he lacked manners simply because he did. And since her marriage, she had found her husband valued, plain speaking above almost anything else. She supposed that was why he had married a woman who spoke plainly, rather than one who could not. Then she smiled and asked if they would care for more tea. The two ladies who had come to draw blood realized they had been answered without being given a single weapon to carry back. They left baffled, reporting to Lady Sidonia that the country duchess was far harder to break than expected. But the calls left a mark all the same. After they left, Eulalia sat alone feeling that familiar chill from the edges of 100 ballrooms. It was the feeling of being surrounded by smiling faces waiting for her to stumble. The campaign against her was real patient and relentless. Sooner or later it would find its mark. Already her own famous story was drifting back to her, twisted now into a tale of vulgarity rather than honesty. In the late summer, when the Duke gave a great ball at High Hall, his first since his brother's death, Lady Sidonia arrived. Invited by right of old family connection, she brought her campaign directly into the house. The ball was to be Eulalia's formal presentation to the county and half of London. Sidonia had chosen it with cold strategic precision as the ground to destroy her. Eulalia dressed that evening with a heavy heart. She knew the full shape of the rumors by then. She knew who was spreading them, and she knew the ball was a trap. Many were attending solely in the hope of seeing the country duchess disgrace herself. Looking at her reflection in the first truly fine gown she had ever owned, she felt that old dread from 100 ballrooms, the absolute certainty of being found wanting. For a moment, her courage failed her. Philip found her there. He had come to escort her down, but he stopped in the doorway watching her. Then he crossed the room to stand behind her, their eyes meeting in the glass. "You are afraid," he said. It was not a question. He had come to know her too well for questions. "They are all coming to watch me fall," she replied. "Sidonia has seen to that. I know what they say, Philip, that you regret marrying me, that I am a rustic joke you have already tired of, that I trapped you." She had not meant to speak his name. It had slipped out the very first time she had used it. She let it hang in the quiet room. "I do not know how to fight her," she whispered. "She fights with smiles and whispers, and those are not weapons I have. If I answer cruelty with cruelty, I become the vulgar creature she claims I am. And if I say nothing, they will think it is true. I do not know what to do." He was quiet for a moment, then turned her gently by the shoulders to face him away from the glass. "You called me Philip," he said. "I did. I am sorry. Do not be sorry. I have been waiting almost a year to hear it." There was that trace of a smile again, but fuller now, closer to a real one than she had ever seen. "Eulalia, listen to me, because I am about to tell you something true, and we do not lie to each other. You ask how to fight a woman who uses smiles and whispers. You do not fight her. You have never once won by being anything other than exactly who you are, and you will not start tonight. She wants you to trade in her currency so she can prove you are exactly what she claims. Do not give her that satisfaction. Go down those stairs and be the woman who told a duke he had no manners at her father's table. Be honest, be kind, and be entirely without fear. Let every soul in that ballroom see the difference between a woman who speaks the truth and one who merely says pretty things. That is a contest you cannot lose, because you have been fighting it your whole life. In fact, it is the only reason I am standing here." She looked at him. "You told me once," she said slowly, "that you had no love left to offer. I did. Was it true? The Duke of Pendrith looked at his wife in the candlelight on the eve of the ball meant to destroy her, and he kept his promise. He did not lie. No, he said, it was not true. Indeed, it has not been true for quite some time. I think it stopped being true at your father's table, though I did not realize it then. I have been frozen a long while, Eulalia. I told myself I liked it, because a frozen man cannot be hurt, and I had been broken past bearing, and did not mean to feel that ever again. And then a woman in an old gown told me the truth across a table of bad mutton. She would not be afraid of me, and she wanted nothing from me. That ice I had guarded so carefully began to crack. I have been thawing ever since, quite against my own will, and it is the best thing that has happened to me in 11 years. I did not marry you to be left in peace. I told myself I did, but I married you because you were the only living thing that had reached me since my brother died, and I could not let you go back to the edge of some other man's ballroom. That is the truth. You asked for it, and there it is. And now let us go down and let London see what an honest woman looks like. She could not speak. Instead, she put her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart, feeling it beat hard and fast under her palm. This man who had sworn he was frozen. She found her eyes had filled, and she blinked the tears back. There was a ball to go to, and a battle to be fought. Still, she left her hand where it was a moment longer, and he covered it with his own. Neither of them spoke. The thing was said now and did not need repeating. Then she lifted her chin, took his arm, and they went down together. The ball was everything Lady Sidonia had planned, and yet nothing that she had planned. The great rooms of High Hall blazed with light, filled by the county and half of London. Every eye turned as the Duke and the new Duchess came down the stair. A low hum of anticipation ran through the crowd, the eagerness of people gathered to witness a fall. Lady Sidonia stood near the foot of the stairs, exquisite in silver, wearing her pleasant, ready smile. She made her move early before the dancing began. It was just as she had planned, cornering them among a knot of the most important guests where the maximum number of the right people would hear. She greeted the Duchess with a wide, warm, poisonous civility. In a voice pitched to carry, she remarked how brave it was of dear Eulalia to attempt so grand an entertainment, and how charming that the Duke had married a wife with such refreshingly natural country manners. She did so hope the evening would not prove too great a strain, as a house like High Hall could be demanding for one not born to it. Every word was a knife wrapped in silk. The circle waited smiling for the country Duchess to redden, stammer, or lash out to prove her own vulgarity. Eulalia did none of those things. She merely looked at Lady Sidonia, with her level grey gaze, the gaze that saw what people truly were, rather than what they wished to seem. She let a small silence fall. Then she spoke without heat in the clear, quiet voice she had used at her father's table. "You are very kind to concern yourself, Lady Sidonia. I know that you had hoped to be mistress of this house yourself, and I am sorry for your disappointment, truly. It is a hard thing to want something for years and see it go another way. I do not hold your feeling against you, but I think you should know that you cannot make me ashamed of who I am by naming it, because I have never been ashamed of it. And a person who is not ashamed cannot be shamed. I was born in a small house to a good father. I learned to speak the truth and to value it, and my husband married me for exactly that reason. No whisper of yours will ever unmarry us, because whispers have no power over people who do not fear the truth. I am truly sorry you have spent your summer on this. It cannot have made you happy, and I would have wished you happier. And the terrible thing, the blow that undid Lady Sidonia completely, was the total absence of cruelty. Had Eulalia struck back with malice, Sidonia could have won. She could have played the injured party, turning the vulgar country Duchess into the villain of the story. Instead, Eulalia met venom with something Sidonia had no defense against: simple honesty, softened by a deep, unbearable, and completely unlooked-for pity. She had named Sidonia's true wound out loud, speaking gently before the entire room, and she had forgiven it and wished her well. There is no smiling reply to that. The crowd gathered to watch a country woman disgrace herself, found themselves witnessing a great lady's cruelty, met with an untouchable grace. and the sympathy of the room, a tide that always flows toward dignity, turned in a single instant and turned entirely against Sidonia. She stood there for a moment, her pleasant smile fixed and dying on her face. And in the instant before Sidonia mastered herself and withdrew, Eulalia saw what lay beneath the beauty. It was fear, not fear of the Duchess, but fear of the future rushing toward her, the empty years opening ahead where she would no longer be the prize match. She had staked her entire self on a crown that had gone to a nobody, and she had nothing left to buy it back. It was a raw, human, frightened thing. Eulalia, who might have exulted, found that she could not. She only felt pity, which was far more painful for Sidonia than any open triumph could have been. Lady Sidonia made her excuses within the hour and left High Hall, and she never troubled the family again. The following year she married a viscount of no great distinction and lived a life of moderate consequence, not at all the life she had dreamed of. That was the sum of her defeat, and those few who understood it agreed it was exactly enough. Philip had watched everything from a short distance. Once Sidonia had gone, he came to his wife's side and did something that completed the evening's work. In full view of the assembled county and half of London, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. As he did so, he looked at her in a way no one in that room could mistake for the cold courtesy of a marriage of convenience. The last of the gossip died that night, never to be revived. The Duke of Pendrith, as everyone who saw them agreed, was not a man who regretted his wife. They danced later on after the crowd had thinned and the music had grown soft. He held her a little closer than the steps required, and she let him. "You told her you were sorry," he said, "and you meant it." She replied that she did. She knew what it was to want something and watch it pass by. Her own wanting was less cruel than Sidonia's, but she knew the pain of it, and it seemed unkind to pretend otherwise. "You are," said the Duke of Pendrith, "the most extraordinary woman in England. I have spent a year being too frozen and too foolish to say so, and I do not intend to waste any more time." He drew back enough to look at her. "I know we made a bargain and agreed not to ask this of each other. But I am asking it now because we do not lie. I will not go on pretending this is a marriage of convenience when it has not been one for months. I love you, Eulalia, not conveniently, and not safely. I love you entirely. I have thawed straight through, and it is your doing. I would rather feel all of it, the grief and the joy, together beside you, than feel nothing at all ever again. That is the truth, and now you may speak." She looked up at him, at the hard, handsome face gone open and unguarded, at the amber eyes that had learned in a year to give something back. "I stopped telling myself it was impossible. Weeks ago," she said. "I only did not say so because I was waiting for you. You are slow, your grace, for a clever man." And then because they did not lie to each other, because it was true, and because she had waited so long to say a true thing to someone who wanted to hear it. "I love you," she whispered. "I have loved you since you took the reproof at my father's table and did not crush me for it. I did not know it then, but I know it now. There. We are neither of us frozen any longer." And he laughed, a sound the county had not heard the Duke of Pendrith make in living memory. Several people turned to look, but he did not care. Together they finished the dance. There was a grief that did not lift, and neither of them ever pretended it did. Edmund was still dead. No happiness of Philip's could reach back to mend the letter he had never written, or the coldness he had let stand. He carried that quietly to the end of his days, the way a man carries an old wound that has healed, but still aches in certain weathers. But he carried it now as a living man carries such things, and not as a frozen one. Eulalia knew the whole of it, and never once asked him to feel less than he did. That was the gift she gave him, a gift no one else could have offered. The same gift she had given him in her aunt's grey garden, to stand with him in the hard thing, and not fill the silence. His mother, the dowager, lived long enough to see it holding the first of her grandchildren before she died. He was a small, dark-haired boy with his father's amber eyes. Already everyone said, though, he was far too young for anyone to truly know, that he had his mother's habit of looking at people as though he could see what they truly were. They called him Edmund, It was Eulalia's idea. Philip could not have proposed it, but when she did, he had to leave the room for a while. When he returned, his eyes were wet, and he only pressed her hand. That was all, and it was enough. Years later, when they were no longer young, the Duke and Duchess of Pendrith would sometimes dine alone at the great table at High Hall. At the near end of the table, close enough to talk, their places always laid together. For 200 years, generations of Pendriths had sat marooned at opposite poles of that vast mahogany. Now, on quiet evenings like this, Philip would look down the empty stretch of wood toward the vacant seat. He would remember a raw autumn night in a modest house 2 counties south, a woman in a reworked gown who did not even know his name. Across a table of disguised mutton, she had told him the truth. Boredom, she said, was not a misfortune that befell him, but a discourtesy he chose to show to others. She suspected no one had ever dared tell him the difference. But someone did that night. It cost her everything she had to give, spent on a stranger who could do nothing for her, simply because it was true and needed saying. He had crossed a cold, empty lifetime to reach her after that, and he had never once regretted it. A house, a life, a heart, none of them are saved by those who whisper what you want to hear. They are salvaged only by the rare person with the courage to speak the truth across the table, especially when that truth is the last thing you want to hear, but the first thing you need. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and how these words found you. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story.